All right. Welcome everybody. This is exciting. The compositing section usually always comes at the very end, like Lindsay was saying, but we thought about bringing it at the beginning because as you composite at the end of the process, you get to see every prior department, and basically you have to try and correct everything in order to prevent sending everything back. So in that sense, you become a troubleshooter of all departments. You learn a little bit about each department and how to tweak things without having to send things back. And not only that, but because we see the final picture and we might have advice on how to improve the pipeline so that when it hits compositing or when it hits another department, they'll have tips to make it easier on the next department, so that the final product can be as great as possible with the least amount of resistance, shall we say. Um, so let me just switch to that first slide here. We're just going to talk, broadly about what comp can do when we are brought in at the beginning, if we were to be brought in at the beginning. Oftentimes, you have that pilot that Lindsay was talking about, and you start your season. Compositing is only hired at the very tail end. If you're lucky enough to bring, at minimum, your supervisor in earlier, you can then kind of involve them earlier in the process. And that can be really handy, not only handy, but kind of key to preventing further errors for your production. You might, prepare things differently if you have that knowledge early on rather than trying to fix it in comp, as everybody kind of says. So the first thing is to see what your art director and your design department has designed for this show that you've got to put together, right? So what's the look? What are we trying to achieve globally as a company or as a production to get to the final results? And if your art direction is precise and they're like, here's what we want that character to look like, or here's what we want that lighting to look like on the character in the show. And I'm speaking, strictly from a comp perspective here. Then comp can go, is that possible? And the answer is always yes. But the question is, do we have everything in place to get to that end result? So we might go, okay, well, first of all, what's the target? Is it a cutout animation show or a traditional animation show? So if it's cutout, you're going to have pieces. You're going to have access to that arm separate from that leg. If it's traditionally animated, you're going to have a single drawing most likely, or a few of them, and it's going to be hand drawn. So you're going to not have the same access. You're going to have to kind of think about how you want to achieve that look later on in the process. So knowing, first of all, that target, you can then go, okay, design, we have, this much time, this many people to do it. This is that complexity. We think we can achieve 2/3 of what you want, but that 1/3 we're going to have to negotiate. And so with that knowledge, design might go, okay, well, we'll redesign our approach. We know we have to kind of pull it back a little bit because we don't have all of the pieces in play, the time, the crew, the money to do it. So based on that assessment, that R&D phase that you want to use comp for at the beginning, we're then going to tailor our designs towards what's sustainable for this production, what's possible for this crew, and then you get a result that's synergistic and everybody is able to collaborate rather than compositing being stuck at the end going, how are we going to get this done with not having enough people or time or whatnot. So that's the first step, is communicating with your design department. I guess I could switch slides to get to the next one there. So that's the main thing. Obviously, your compositors, you want to hit the art director's vision as best as possible. One of the biggest compliments that I ever got in my career was somebody else winning an award, but that award could only have been, won if comp had done their job properly. So we got an award for art direction in one of our TV programs that we worked on, and there is no compositing award. So knowing that that art direction got followed through all the way to the end of the product, and they won the award for it, that's as good as a reward as we're going to get in comp. So we took it. But yeah, design will basically, composite will study the design, see what the target is, and try to collaborate that way. So in that, having a collaboration with design and the art director to make sure that we can get to the end result. Now there's one slide I don't have here, which is just BG layout. And the only reason I want to touch base on that is You do want the compositor just to have a quick chat with your background and layout team, if only because you want to make sure you've got the proper layers separated. Just as an example, you've got an underwater shot and you want to be able to make the water distort. But if that water is baked with everything else on top of it, you've got, your sand and your midgrounds and your foreground. If everything's flattened, then you can't separate that water and make it look as nice as you want it to. You can't deform it. So you definitely want to have that conversation with the background artist saying, don't forget, in this show, I need to make this move. So make sure that the background is on its own and then everything else separated accordingly so that I can, make it move a certain way in comp, and I can create multi-planes so that when the camera moves through, each plane will have distance to the camera and move at a different speed, creating a lot of depth. That's obviously depending on the type of project you've got. If you've got a very flat show, maybe that's not necessary. But on a show where you want to plus that look, then it's definitely something you want to talk with your background artist about. One other thing you want to talk to the background artist about is something that very few people know, but in international markets, yes, you'll work on your English show, but it'll be sold to international markets. And for that, they need to have no English text on your backgrounds, because otherwise, if you're trying to sell something to Mexico, or you're trying to sell something to Italy, they don't speak in English. So you basically will have what's called a textless background, which basically means you're removing all alphabetic letters. And if the background artist has baked those letters into your backgrounds, then your compositing artist is going to have a struggle creating the textless version for international distribution. These are the kinds of things that, again, bringing the compositing artist in early just to have a quick chat will create, a more synergistic pipeline that, there'll be less struggle at the end. And at least they'll know how to do it. Otherwise, they're going to have to go back into their background and redraw what's supposed to be behind the text, because sometimes they won't have a source that's blank in the first place.
And I just want to add to that really
Yeah.
quickly because I've had a lot of experience with the textless backgrounds. I can't even tell you how many times I've worked on a show with text, and then it goes through the pipeline a couple episodes, and then it's actually our job to go back as a rigging artist to go back into all the props, all of the backgrounds. Well, maybe not all the backgrounds, but all the props, any of the characters, anything that we've contributed words to and had to remove those words, update the backgrounds, update the images from designs. So it is quite a really it's a quite big detail that's often missed. And so the more people that kind of know it, the better. I actually really believe that one. And the other part about that is on top of having textless backgrounds, there's also the option where if you watch cartoons, you're going to see that they make their own language. And that's another way to bypass the textless issue, or not issue, but like the textless designs. Um, and then that way, there's usually somebody designing a language specifically for every show, so or that needs it.
Yeah, they call it gibberish text, which is such a blessing when it comes to comp, because we don't have to worry about having to even deal with it. That goes straight to international markets and it's not an issue. Yeah, thanks for talking about that. That's a really good point that brings us into the rigging option, which obviously you just said if you have a prop or something that has text, then we'll want to have a conversation with the rigging artist as well, make sure that they either separated on its own drawing or even separated on its own layer. So if you're working in Harmony, you've got 4 layers: your line art, color art, your underlay, and your overlay. If the text is on only a single one of those layers, I can just feed through the other 3 and omit the text for my text list. So that's definitely something that could be helpful there. One of the things that a seasoned comp artist could come in and help rigging with is just kind of reviewing a few of the basic rigs to make sure that they have what they need to get to the next department. So sometimes what will happen is, and this might only happen at the end, unfortunately, but once it's in production, you might see what your rig in motion looks like. And a compositor that is accustomed to fixing a lot of those issues might go, oh, I'm going to have to fix that in every scene. So then they have to go back to the rigging artist and tell them, hey, can you fix the source so that 5 or 6 shows down, when we catch up to it, we'll at least won't have to do it every scene anymore. Example of that, you've got a character with conversion points. You also might not see, but if you shrink a character down or you grow it really big, sometimes if they have a blur value in there, then it might not, keep up. Or you might have little seams because shrinking it down will create an artifact you didn't expect. And definitely comp will know how to fix that because we face a lot of different situations. But if we can instruct the rigging artist, hey, I caught this when I was just testing with it, then the sooner that happens, the better, because a rigging artist will do their character. That gets put to a setup artist that puts it in, say, 300 scenes for that episode. So if it's fixed at the beginning, that's 300 scenes I don't got to go and touch. But if I catch it at the end, I got to go fix 300 individual scenes. So that's one of the biggest advantage if we have that time to get that comp artist to do some R&D and just kind of play with the rig and see if they can break it or expect what could potentially happen in production. Another thing that might happen, color issues or miscolored parts. That's, super rare, but sometimes that'll happen where something gets colored a certain amount, a certain swatch, but it's supposed to use a different swatch. And that'll happen, say, if you have eye whites, eye highlights, teeth, they all look like they are the same color, but if I want to color them differently, they all need to have their own swatch, their own ID, right? So that's one of those situations where, again, with R&D and your comp artist, he'd be able to pick up what's going on and what we might want to avoid to not, again, fix those 300 shots. And that's kind of the general stuff that we will talk about with rigging. One last category I'll talk about is it's nice when you've got your head, your main body parts separated in separate composites. That way, if the comp artist needs to isolate certain areas, he can just say, hey, there's the head, there's the arm, rather than having, all the arms, all the pieces wired into one big long composite, then it becomes a bit more of a task for us to isolate areas, essentially. So just having that dialogue with the rigging artist to make sure that not only is it good for animation, but that it'll help at the comp stage. And if we have any other tips that we can think about to speed things up, that we definitely want to have that conversation, such as if we need to hit a certain design target and it would be helpful for it to be in the rig, then we can suggest to the rigging artist to put, I don't know, a texture or a certain node that will allow us to pull things out, such as eye whites, or any other solution that you need to have ready for the compositing stage. Obviously, you don't want to bog down the animation stage or anyone else, so you might put, disconnect them for the time being while they're in the rig, or add visibility nodes to turn them off so it doesn't bother animation. Then when it gets to comp stage, we can turn them on. At least they're available rather than us having to rebuild it every time. So those are suggestions for the rigging process that I would suggest. And then we get to the animation stage. The animation stage, not too many things I have to talk about there. The only couple of things is you'd want to come back and have a dialogue with your animation director if compositing is catching anything that is off. For instance, if you've got a character that's supposed to turn around, but the animator has decided to put, another character in a different pose because it's easier for them to reuse, say, a run cycle, pop another animation rig of the same character and just switch to it, that means you now have doubled the compositor's work because we have to apply to each character individually. So just having an honest conversation with your animation director and make sure that everyone's working in a streamlined fashion. We also in comp will, as you'll see when I do a little demo, we kind of mess up the node view. We just kind of clutter that thing. We try to keep it as tidy as possible, but we also have to be aware that in a production pipeline, it's very possible that a scene that's been done in comp will go back a previous department, an upstream department. So animation might go and need to fix something after comp's been in there, and we don't want them to lose their minds. So it's up to us to try to make it pretty, or at least have a separate composite or system to just kind of wire down and display to make sure that everybody is able to work properly without it getting too confused. We also will, again, try to organize our own node view. We know that animation is going to go in there. Generally, I think animation uses their timeline in Harmony more so than the node view, but if we go in there, we just want everybody to be comfortable. So just having that kind of conversation and knowing that comp is at the end of the process. Like I said at the beginning, we fix a lot of background issues, we fix a lot of animation issues. Um, if we see something recurring, we might go and talk to the animation director and say, hey, your artist might benefit from knowing that if they do this, they'll have a better result or something like that, such as using weighted deformers to make sure that things blend properly when things are breaking with a regular deformer. Misalignments, deformation problems, that's the kind of stuff I've been talking about. But just having that conversation with the animation, making sure that everybody is able to work as effectively as possible. And lastly, before comp is effects. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Ask a question. Sorry, I'm gonna
Go
ask a
for it.
question before you move on to FX. I feel like you mentioned it in the first slide, but I think that it would be really relevant to go over it for animation. It's a really good tip, and it's one that I learned when you were explaining this series of slides to me. But in your first slide, you also have animation using one rig. And could you
Yeah.
just kind of talk about that process a little bit? Because that was a really good tip. I want to make sure that
Yeah.
that's really clear for people right now too.
Oh, there it goes. Use single character rigs in animation. So that's sort of what I was discussing, how you might have an animator that wants to use a run cycle. So they'll bring that from their library and put it in the scene. That'll be a second character from their original characters. So now I've got, say, two characters instead of one, which means I've got to double my work. If the animator is able to just copy their keyframes and just have one rig for everything, then that simplifies the work for the compositor, that I only need to do my work one time rather than duplicating everything and making sure it works between two rigs or three rigs, depending on the amount of rigs the animator might have used. That's kind of the gist of hopefully using a single character rig per animation. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it answers the question.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's a very common practice for
Yeah.
animators to take rigs and either rip them apart and use different pieces, or literally pull them off screen so that they're almost animating over there, and then when they want them, they'll pull them back on screen. It's super common practice, but I didn't realize that it could actually quadruple the work of a compositing artist. So if you could master that skill, it's a good one.
It can definitely complicate things. It's one thing that's good to know is with every situation that your compositor faces, they learn more, right? So if we go, oh, we got to deal with this now. How do we solve this issue without having to send it back? And then they learn even more. So if somebody were to break that rig and just make that arm huge, we'll know how to address that situation. For instance, sometimes we'll want a blur attributed to a character, and if you do something like blow the arm huge, then you all of a sudden are changing the blur value as well. So then we just need to know how to adapt and solve the issue, or send it back and go, you really got to fix this. We got a question here. The animators and riggers know what kind of compositing will be done on each shot. That's probably more of an animation rigging question. If they look at the design targets, then they probably would have an idea. And that's the kind of dialogue that is really good to have at the beginning of the production process in the R&D phase, and make sure that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, I would say that there's always reference material that we look at, but I would say that because of the way a pipeline flows, like always upstream to downstream, I guess, comp being downstream, um, we probably know the least about what comp does, and their job is really to make it work. So sometimes they are a bit of like the cowboys of the industry, and they just get the job done. So we might know what the design is supposed to look like, and we'll do our best to set it up that way. But then, and this is from a rigging perspective, when you pass that information to a animator, if they're not thinking the same thing that we're thinking, they might actually do something completely different and then give compositing something that's very different. So that kind of happens in the animation industry. But we always know what it's supposed to look like, and then we do our best to get it there for the end.
It's also important to know that the design, the art direction, generally does fall mostly on effects and comp in terms of lighting, whereas the animation would be a style, the type of animation and the stuff like that. So as much as animation might not know what comp's going to do, they have their own kind of targets to hit, which are independent of compositing. Sometimes it's got to work together, obviously, but sometimes it's really just style of animation, lighting, comp, and then just making sure it all comes together nicely.
And even with a production, you're gonna have about 52. Like, you can have up to 52 episodes per season. So what typically happens is designs start to get repetitive. So if your show happens underwater, you're gonna have a bunch of water-specific effects or water-specific compositing effects, and they'll get reused. Whereas, that one episode where they go to space, somehow a whale's tail flips them into space and they're shooting through a rocket. There's always some scenario where it's random and ridiculous. That might be something where people have to make up more on the fly, but a show usually has like a set of standards and rules, and you'll be reusing that information as you go.
Yeah, either that or your art director will spring some new designs per location just so you have an idea what it's supposed to look like. Cool. Let's go to the effects department. So effects and comp, we generally try to work as best together as we can. Sometimes effects might be overwhelmed with the amount of work they've got on their plate for a specific episode. You might have effects heavy shows, whereas some other ones are, just a stroll through the forest, nothing else happening. Other ones might be, there's explosions and bubbles and all kinds of different things happening. So some might be more involved. And you've got a couple of options when you get to that spot. You can either say, hey, you got to work harder, or you could say, we're going to cut some of these because for time, budget, schedule, team, or potentially your composite department can alleviate some of that pressure by doing some of the stuff. So comp not only does lighting, but we can also produce procedural effects as well. We were talking about particle effects, which are generated instances of a bubble, and then you've got bubbles happening everywhere. I think we're reviewing one later on in the feedback zone, so that'll be an interesting thing to look at. You can have, turbulence noise that you can use, which is basically just noise that's black and white and generating that you can use to create fog. You can use it to create clouds. You can use it as a mat to twinkle your stars in the sky. There's a lot of different things that comp can do that will help get the message across without having to involve effects, drawing hand frame, frame by frame, everything that's on their plates. So that's an honest conversation to have with your effects department and go, hey, do you guys have too much on your plate here? We can probably take some of that and create a particle effect that'll help you out in this case. Not only that, but sometimes you've got effects artists that just like to draw the shapes, but not get too involved with the final look, such as, a fire. How does that glow? How does that look? What kind of interactive lighting is it casting on the environment? How far does the effects artist go beyond drawing the shape? And so that's, again, that conversation you want to have with your effects artist and go, hey, you just draw the shapes. We'll make sure we're making it look good at the end. We'll do these glows for the effects. We'll cast lighting on the environment. We'll cast lighting on our characters, and we'll have that control so you don't have to worry about it. But those are the kinds of collaborations, and the best productions you'll ever work on are full collaborations between all of your departments. So the better, the more you can be involved at the beginning and have those conversations with everyone and just like help out. Every department helps each other out. That's the best kind of productions I've ever worked on. And then that brings us to the comp department specifically, where you basically have to evaluate when you're starting a pipeline, how you're going to go about it. So how big is the team's going to be? That's usually based on a budget, because how much money do you have to spend to pay those people? What's the skill set of your team? You're going to have your strong compositors, and you're going to have some that are maybe a little more green and new to the industry. There have been people with technical skills and some with creative skills. You'll have compositors that have taken and learned animation, which will be really good at fixing the animation and creating nuance in anything that they do in their compositing. And then you'll have your more technical artists which will know exactly where to plug things in and be as effective and speedy as possible. So these are the kinds of things you would consider about basically building your limits. The shot count is very important. So if every one of your episodes has really long shots, compositing generally will set up a shot the same way, whether it's 3 minutes long or 3 seconds long. Hopefully you don't have a 3-minute long shot. That would be hell for anybody working on it. But we basically plug in all the lighting and then we tweak things based on what's happening in the scene. So if you have a shot count of 200 versus a shot count of 350, that's going to change how you prepare your team to say, hey, you're going to get 25 shots instead of 12 in this period, and that'll determine how fast you can get stuff done as well. And then, of course, the lighting complexity, which is, do you have a very flat show such as F is for Family or Family Guy, or do you have something that's really pushing the boundaries of light to get closer to a feature quality animation? There's different projects, they have different styles. So what is the style we're trying to achieve? And is it possible with A, B, and C? And yeah, overall depth of look, that's kind of the gist of what we do in there. And then we're just assessing the strengths and weaknesses of everybody so that we can assign the scenes in sequence, hopefully, so that that sequence looks good and it's contained. So if one person's doing the same sequence, then that whole sequence is going to be in continuity with itself. And obviously people will be able to help each other out, but the idea is to have those assignments based on strengths and weaknesses and just globally working as a team to get the result done. One of the things that we talked about with Lindsay is basically you've got your 26 episodes or your 52 episodes and they're all underwater. You're going to reuse your stuff. So if you've got a certain environment, then you're going to color the characters the same in those environments. So once you've figured that out in your R&D phase, then you can reuse and plug and plug and plug into each of the subsequent sequences that are in the same environment. So you're going to get some wins that way to speed things up as well. And that's kind of the gist of what I would talk about for your production pipeline. If you can involve comp at the beginning, we can have a conversation with every department on how to best optimize not only the pipeline, but also make sure that the end result looks like what everybody else has been hoping to do. And if we get to the comp stage and we make it look worse, then we've hurt all the prior departments. So our job is just to make it look that much better or make it that much more functional to the whole pipeline. Does that do you have any other immediate questions, Lindsay, before I continue into a demo, or good to go?
I don't have any questions, but I do want to make sure that if anybody else has any questions, now is the time to to ask them, and then we can move on to the demo.
Yep, I'm down with that.
We have a question. What could hurt the company process? Ooh, that's a good question. Not having teamwork, I would say, is the number one. Not having a clear vision, or not being able to articulate the vision. I would say that's probably the hardest part for any artist. And it's actually something that I'm hoping to teach at Eat Your Peas as how to communicate your vision. So if you are seeing something and you want other people to make it, that is a skill set on its own. So I would say communicating the vision to keep everybody on the same page.
I'd also say it depends on your approach, right? When I started my career, I worked at a studio where I felt overwhelmed, like everybody does when they're starting out their careers. They always feel like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. I've got imposter syndrome and whatnot. And I would ask questions to my teammates. And I was in Toronto at the time, and I remember them being very apprehensive about giving me any answers because at the time they felt very much like it was in a competitive environment. So if they gave me the answer, then I wouldn't be able, I would basically go for their job. So that became a very frustrating situation for me and very difficult. At some point, it clicked for me how to do this stuff to the point where they were then coming to me for the answer. And I can say honestly that that was probably one of the worst experiences, is not having that collaboration. And in contrast, having that experience where everybody in each department was helping each other out was the very best experience I've ever had on a show. So when you're asking what stunts the process, that's definitely one of them. If you're holding on to your secrets, if you're like, oh well, I'll teach them 50%, but not the whole 100 because I don't want them to take my job, then you're doing yourself a disservice. It's just about you upping your game if you are worried about losing your job to somebody else, but more importantly, collaborating and sharing ideas and learning. I've had compositors that I've taught for years, and I'll get somebody new to the business. I'll teach them a bunch of stuff, and then they'll show me something I never knew the software could even do. So you're always learning from different people, and that's the best way to learn. The other thing I'll say that really stunts the process is if you have someone that's micromanaging too much. So obviously there's got to be some structure, but if someone's like checking on every little bit and not letting you be creative or not letting you kind of expand the way that you work, then that's going to stunt your progress. That's going to stunt just the general progress of everybody. And obviously there's got to be some guidelines, but there's a million ways to comp, I like to say. You know, you might do it one way, you might do it another way. As long as the end result looks good and you haven't spent a week on something that should have taken an hour, then we're on the same page. Just as one more anecdote, I had one guy, he came and he only knew Nuke and I taught him Harmony. And when I went into his scenes to see what he had done, because he was giving me some beautiful work, but I had this little tweak I had to do. I went into his scene, my mind exploded because my gosh, nobody comps like that, but he made it work. He basically recreated Harmony to work like Nuke because that's what he understood and that got the end result. Obviously, multiple ways that you can comp. If the end result looks good, if the person feels motivated because they can be creative and not restricted, that's the best way, I would say. We got other questions?
Yeah, actually, I do have a question. And I also would like to second that that is a very sad position to be in when you are on a team and there's no structure, no guidance, no feedback. That's a hard one. Those are always the hardest shows. They make for the longest days.
Yeah.
Okay, I did have a question. Where is it? How many compositors typically work on a single episode?
Well, that depends on the style of the show and budget. Generally, on a lot of the shows that I worked on in the early parts of my career, you might have 2 to 3 compositors for the entire season. But then the style of the show is going to, be a certain style. For something that's more ambitious, example, Last Kids, I think we had some 20 artists at some point working on that. For something like a feature film like Space Jam, we had 35, which is enormous. But currently, say my current crew's 5 people. So it depends on the style of the show. It depends on how much you want to push that look. But the general amount I would say is between 2 to 3 to 5 for an average television show.
Are you saying that? Are you saying that Last Kids on Earth had 20 compositors?
At some point, yeah,
Wow.
15 on average, but at some point it became 20 because we were very ambitious and we didn't rein it down. But then we developed techniques to make sure that that was sustainable in a certain way. So again, you're resilient, you adapt with whatever you need to do, you create new tools and you get the results you want, or you got to really pull it back. It's just that after we had done the first 3 episodes, which were really reaching for the moon, then we had to reevaluate, hey, how much do we pull back before it looks like nothing else that we had already done, right? We had to stay on target, but just kind of tweak it. So yeah, we had 20 at one time, went back to 50.
Okay, so I think we are, if there's not any more questions, I think we're good to go to the demo. And
Cool.
I'm pumped to see.
I'm pumped to play. So yeah, I got this background in an animated character just today, and it was fun to play around with that. Let me just switch to the Harmony scene. Can we all see this scene with the character? Yeah, cool. Okay. So I'm not, obviously there's so much I can talk about for comp for days. The general thing I want to talk about, obviously I'm working on one tiny little screen, whereas I'm used to working on 2 screens. It feels a little condensed. I'll just talk about the things I want to do to get this scene to look good. And along the way, I'll throw in some compositing tips for you so you understand why I'm doing certain things. So I've got this character. Obviously, generally, it would just be animated sitting in the scene. Right now, I'm the one positioning it. So we've got a character here, and I'll say that I like to have all my elements pegged together with a master peg, just so that if I have to move everything together, I have it all connected to one peg. I'm not going to need to do that, but we'll see.
It's a very important animation tip, actually, for animation scenes in general. Always have a master peg. Good tip.
Yeah. So I'm going to shrink this character down so this scene makes more sense. Let's move that down over here. And if I scrub through it, you can see that there's a problem already with my scene. These are the kind of things that I'd say are part of compositing's bread and butter. You've got to troubleshoot why something's not working for you and why and how to get to the result you want as best as possible. Again, millions of ways to comp, but here's one of the systems that I use. We got the leg, it's behind the background. That's because your character is coming through and has Z depth for each pieces in the character. Generally, compositing will flatten everything together so that we can start layering things out. And if there's, the character has to be behind a foreground plane, we'll deal with that. In this case, I really just want to make sure that leg's not behind the background. So I'm just going to flatten the character. And to do that, you just create a composite. As long as it's a bitmap composite, then that's your square composite in Harmony. That will flatten your character to a single Z depth plane. And now you can see he's flattened on top of the background. So solve that first issue. Now, if I press render to this, we'll see what the scene looks like. And that looks good, but the character really doesn't sit in that environment. We really want to make sure that it fits the environment. And not only that, we're going to add some lighting so that it matches to this flame that's in the background. First thing I want to do is darken the character to fit the environment roughly, right? So I can do that with a variety of tools. I'll use a color scale in this case, and I do it after the composite. So here I've got different colors, and the way that I work is I reduce the channels that I don't need to get the color that I want. So if I'm looking at this scene, it's a darkened bluish nighttime scene, and yes, there's yellow light in there, but that will do after the fact as a highlight. So I want to pull away from colors that aren't the blues that I'm trying to keep. So I'm going to reduce my reds and my greens as well as the value to make sure that character darkens a bit. So see what happens. I'm going to stay in render mode so we see what happens as well. I'll go to 0.8 on my red. Already it's starting to look better. Let's go to 0.9 on the greens. And then let's try a 0.9 value. And that sits definitely better than if I had done nothing. So this is before and that's after. You can play around with all the other things. I'll say that, alpha and hue, I wouldn't play with those in the color scale. Same with saturation. If you wanted to play with any of these, I really recommend using the actual hue saturation node. It's just more accurate for that kind of work. But just to pull values out of a channel, color scale is definitely one that we use generally for our art. One of the things that we like to do when we darken a character is make sure that the facial expressions are still very much readable. So we'll pop the eye whites back. We'll maybe pop the teeth whites as well. In this case, he's got no teeth. So I'm just going to focus on the eye whites. And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can physically go and get the eye whites, which we'll do now. But there's another technique that I'm going to show, which is definitely a game changer for a lot of people. And I think some people will enjoy that one. So first I need to find the eye whites. So I'm going to just select the eye and hit O on my network to get straight to it. There's the pupil. If I look down, there's a group. And if I look down, I'm actually in the eye group here. So there are my eyes here. So if I turn things on and off, you can see that's that foreground eye actually has the eyebrow as well. So one thing you could do if we wanted to pull the eyebrow is group them together and wire that out. And the way to wire it out is you go to the multi-port out, it creates a new port for you to wire outside the group, since that's where we did our art. And then if you
Mark, I have
wire
a quick
this over
question.
here, sorry?
Uh, I just had a quick question because
Yeah.
I'm familiar with this process and I've been a little bit more comfortable with it, but I'm getting a little more comfortable with it. But can you also speak a little bit to the trial and error of the like figuring out how to get something to look as specific as you do? Because you also make it look really, really good, but somebody that's starting out might have to do trial and error with all of the nodes and all of the like
Oh,
little
absolutely.
covers, but like the color picking and like even pulling from the network while you're kind of explaining this would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're trying to do color work, there are different nodes that you can use for sure. Color scale is definitely one of the ones I would target the most. But if you're playing around trying to see how am I going to make that character look like it's part of the background, you're really just looking at shades, right? You're looking at this blue, this green, and you're saying, I need to make it look like that. When I'm looking at, let's see if I can bring this up here. Color wheel. I think I have a color wheel in here actually. There you go. Let's turn this guy off. Let's make that bigger. So there's your RGB, your red, green, and blue. So when you're trying to blend something to a color, you're basically trying to get the absence of the other colors. So if you're looking at your color wheel, you go, I got green here, I got red here. I'm trying to get this blue or maybe towards this area. That means I need less red, less green. And if you were working with obviously a bigger spectrum, you need less magenta, less yellow, yes, less cyan. Well, the cyan is what you're trying to get. So that's my logic in going into color scale and pulling away values so that I can focus on that value. If I was near a fiery pit, then I would want to pull away from the blues and the greens so that I get the reds. So if you're using color wheel, you can kind of think of it in that sense, color-wise. That's sort of one technique to do it. Otherwise, if you go inside your filters, you'll see a bunch of nodes, obviously, in Harmony of the different nodes you can use. In terms of color changing, you've got color scale, you've got hue saturation, you can use different shades and blend them on top, highlights and tones, which we'll talk about shortly. But suppose we just wanted to remove that color scale and add a hue saturation instead. We could then perhaps colorize the creature and just go to the blues, maybe not as blue. And that's just clicking that and making sure that's one color, for example.
Yeah, and that's a really good example of, it's really easy to take it too far in Harmony and you have
Yeah.
to learn each node individually and kind of like too much, too little, too much, too
Yeah.
little, too hot, too cold until you find the right one.
So one trick I like to do sometimes if I'm playing around is wire your original character underneath. You'll see if I remove it, there he is. And then you can just add a transparency to the thing you put on top, and then you've got half of the blue added to the character. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is if you had a different palette, you could color the character a certain color you want, switch to that with a color override or a color fade. It's all about just kind of playing with these nodes and seeing what works for you and what doesn't. So if I go back to my color scale, the difference with the color scale is that I'm dictating the amount of color I want to withdraw from the character, whereas here I'm adding something on top with a transparency over the original and coming back to the original. One way is better than the other in a way. The reason that this is less favorable is, and you won't notice it, but you're doubling your edge since you've got two characters stacked on top of each other. The alpha, the edge of your character will get a little harder, but it's very much not noticeable. Yeah,
And
I'm not
that's
sure if you
something
can see if I zoom in there.
you're going to notice when you get to that professional level.
Yeah,
this is this is our job. We zoom into the pixels and we really take a look and we can notice these little details, but that comes with practice and that comes with that keen eye.
exactly. But yeah, definitely playing around with as many nodes as you can to see what each one does is what I would recommend. Once you do have, a look you like, then you start to customize it, which is what we're going to do in trying to make the eyes pop a bit more. So the first way that I did it was I went to get the physical eyes and wired a new copy of it. Let's just go back to that just so we're clear on that. So I found them in here. If you're like, I don't know how to navigate this node network, it's just a bunch of wires, just know that you can use your transform tool in Harmony, select any of the pieces as long as they're not locked. And then in your node network, just hit O and you'll zoom straight to the drawing itself. And then knowing where that wires down is what you'll need to pull out as information. So that pupil, here's your eye. You can disable and enable things just to see how it reacts in the camera view. If I select this composite, it's the group of everything I need. And then things are happening here by the rig to make sure that it works properly depending on how the head turns. So just keep going down the hierarchy until you have exactly what you want. And this is coming out of this port. So if you look at 1, 2, 3, 4, the image I want is the fourth port. So if I go back out, this is likely the eye that I want. Outside, it's getting cut, it's getting invert cut. That's all stuff that we want to happen before we pull it out. So knowing that this is one eye and this is the other eye, I'm putting them together in a composite, and I did that pretty quick. Sorry about that, Lindsay. And I'm gonna select the two cutters, and Control H will create a composite. If you forget that trick, you can just create a new composite. It's Control H, or you can find it in your node view here, composite. And then you can wire what you want. So right now I've got both of these eyes. And if I drag it all the way out to the multi-port out, I will create a new port where I can grab that information outside. So one way to find out what you've got is to just throw a display on that. You've got display in here in your favorites, or you can hit Control Y. And then if we look at that result, we'll see what we've pulled out. And that's one quick way to find out what you're dealing with. Let's go back to the final display. So knowing I've got those eyes, if you plug something to the left side of a color scale and a few other nodes, you've got what's called an integrated matte port, which means that whatever I plug in here is going to tell the color scale, you're only going to color where I tell you. So if I do this, right now I've got the reverse, but it's basically said I'm only going to color the eyes blue. If I want the opposite, because I'm trying to keep the eyes bright, then I can just reverse this by double clicking the port. And now I have a blue character with the eye whites pulled out. So it just pops the expression of the character more. That's a basic lesson of how to pull the information, the matte out of what you want to use.
How often would you say that you use this procedure on like in a day to day?
This procedure I would use on a day-to-day every time I've got a night scene, every time I've got a sunset scene, every time I've got a scene where I want to retain the expression of the character despite being in a separate environment. But now I go about it a different way, which I would also want to teach. But the idea of pulling eye whites and making sure the expressions pop is going to be something I use all the time if it's not a normal day scene.
I love it.
Cool.
The expressions are like the number one thing for animation. Facial features are so important to make sure that we don't lose them in the backgrounds of the animations. So I know that this is a really valuable tutorial for everybody right now.
I'm going to go into the technique that I use, which I've developed on a different project. If I lose people, don't worry about it. You've always got a way to do about it. But I feel like if you can follow along, this is going to be a game changer for the way that you work. The reason that this doesn't work so well is if I'm wiring the eyes out and I have an arm going in front of the eyes, the Harmony doesn't know that I've got an arm because I just said color everything except the eyes. So it's going to create white holes in my arm if my eyes are behind it. This other technique basically says, hey, give me the final result of the character, and if the eyes are showing, then cut them, but otherwise don't cut them. So basically, if I throw a color override I connect it to that composite, which is my flattened character. And I just look at that. I've got a flattened original character. I can change any color with a color override. So if I go and find the characters palette, I'm just going to stretch this out a bit. And I'll select all of the colors and move them over to the right side because I want to change all the colors. I want to make sure that the line's no longer the color, the head's no longer the regular color. We're going to change all the colors and we're going to create our own matte. So first I'm going to open up the color swatch for the line. Now I have all those colors. I can say the line is pure black, so 0 value. And you can see it appears in my undo list, so I have a quick way that I can get back to choosing it. Now I'm going to select all of the other palettes and I'm going to choose that last undo because that will apply that very color to all of the other ones in one instant. Now all of the colors of my character are saying now you're black. All the colors are black and that's why my character is not showing anymore. But if I tell this I want the eye whites to be white, let's go back here. White is 100 value. Now the eye whites are white. Everything else is black. If I want the pupils to also stick out and say the pupil highlight, I can select all of those and make those white as well. So now I have those colors showing. And now if an arm goes in front, it knows the arm's going to go in front and not give me the color that I don't want. Let's see if I go back to OpenGL, I'll disable that so I see what I'm doing. I'm just going to move the bow tie in the way just to show the concept. We're hiding the eyes. And if we just turn on our color override, it knows that there's something in front. So it's only going to color the eyes white and everything else is black.
So you create basically a digital mask.
I'm creating areas that I want to pull out, yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Now, the fact that it's black and white doesn't isolate it as a transparent or non-transparent shape. You can see the whole character is still there in an alpha function. So what you want to do is say, hey, we're going to use a grayscale node. And if I open the properties of that grayscale node, you'll see something called matte output. Basically what that says is if I click that on, everything that's black is transparent. Everything that's white is not transparent, is opaque. So one way to look at it is if you preview your matte view, right now I have that off. That's the matte, that's the alpha information I'm pulling. I turn matte output on, that's the information based on the black and white. The black goes to nothing, the white is retained, and now I have those shapes that I can use to cut out that eye. Let's go back to our normal display. I've got this beautiful shape. Let's go back to our render view. So you can see what happens when we just wire out the eyes. That's the issue you're going to face. But if you use this technique, it doesn't matter what goes in front or not. It will know that it only needs to cut out the eyes and not anything else because we've painted that bow tie black. It knows not to use it as an alpha matte. I know this is a bit more advanced, but if you get the concept of painting everything black and what you want to keep white, then you create your own mattes just based on the colors of what's spitting out. Cool.
Okay, I do have one question that's from the
Yes.
chat, and I'm hoping that I'm asking this question because I'm not a Photoshop user, so I don't know the term of the okay, but I'll get to the question. All right, so for layer nodes, are layered nodes commonly used in Harmony, such as making a blue layer set to multiply, overlay, etc. in After Effects or Photoshop? I know the multiply and overlay, but I forget what the drop-down menu is and what that's called. But we do use them in backgrounds, that's for sure, because when we pull in a background from Photoshop that has those options on the layers, what are those? Are they called filters?
Can you ask the question again?
There we go, blending modes, that's what they're called. Are the blending mode nodes used in Harmony? Such as making a blue layers and setting that to multiply.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Your blending node is in the combine category. And under this, you can collect the blending mode. You can ignore everything here. The SWF is an old Harmony function for transferring back to Flash if you ever use that software. But if you want to use it in Harmony, the top drop down will give you, I think, most of the same nodes that you can get in Photoshop, such as your multiply or your screen or your overlay. And with that, you can apply them. One thing to remember, though, is if you are trying to apply a blending node, you have to make sure that that goes through to whatever you were trying to blend to. And what does that mean? I'll give you an example. Let's just draw a shape. So I'm just gonna create a drawing here. I get here, and I will add it to my character. We'll just draw a circle with a brush. Make sure that's on top. Let's just go from here. That'll make sure it's on top. And it's getting deformed. That's awesome. And I'll give it a color. So I'm just going to use what's called a matte blur. And with a matte blur, you can say this is now blue. Now, if I apply that blend mode and make it multiply, what's going to happen is it's going to multiply to the character, but it's not multiplying to the background. The reason for that is it's right on top of the character, which is in the same line of blending. But as soon as you flatten the composite, your blend mode stops functioning for anything that's beyond the character, because now you've got other pixels and it doesn't know how to blend it because it stops. Bitmap composite will flatten it and will not blend beyond it. So if you're trying to make that blue shape blend to the character and the background, you have to make sure you're in a pass-through composite and not a bitmap composite. The difference here is your bitmap is that rectangle, and your pass-through, if you change the mode, is going to be a trapeze. And you'll see that now, because it's a pass-through, it's not stopping at the bitmap comp, it's continuing on to your background and blending to both things properly. So one of the things I definitely say is if you're going to use blend mode, just make sure if things aren't working for you, check to see if you're flattening something before it hits the plane you're trying to blend to, because that's one of the main thing with blend modes. But that's another way to do your night filter.
Thank you so much.
Throw that blue on top and multiply to your character, and there's another night vision you can have. And then you can, use a cutter and use that same eye to make sure that it cuts out. Now I see that eye pupil looks really bad, so I don't want to cut it out as much. And if you want, you can, go and control your pupil to be, well, I don't want to be 100. Maybe I make it 50% of value, and that will cut it by half. These are the little tricks you can do when you're compositing.
That's a great trick. The little that you just change the opacity of the. I mean, that's usually a mistake, but you just did it on purpose. And
yeah. It's whatever trick gets you the result you want. Exactly.
And they use the TPL to reuse it for all the other scenes.
Yeah. Done. I do want to get into lighting this character. I know that I'm kind of blending over stuff. I don't know if you want to take a break and we continue again with the demo a little bit before we get to Q&A.
How much longer do you think it's going to take to do the demo for the lighting? How much
time I need?
Yeah.
10, 15.
Let's just take a quick micro break. This is something that I really appreciate when we're sitting. Again, like it's if you want to animate to be 100, you got to get up sometimes from your desk and just kind of shake out your hips and your legs. So if everybody wants to or run to the washroom, grab some water, it's 2 minutes. We'll take a 2-minute micro break, and then Mark can jump back in and finish his lighting demo, which is awesome.
All right. See you in a bit.
Hey, Lindsay, if I want to ask a question, can I just turn on my mic or?
Yeah, you sure can. I'm literally just gonna, I don't know if you can see the chair that I sit in, so I'm super.
No worries, all good. Thanks.
Yeah, knock yourself out. I'm here. I'm listening.
Oh, okay. Well, it was more a question for Mark, I think. I mean, I don't know. It was regarding the blending mode when there's no background. underneath. Like let's say that I have an effect or I have a full scene in Harmony. It's all lit. There's a blending mode that nicely affects both the character and the background. But I'm trying to export with a transparent background. And when I export it, like the glow, the effect that I have takes the black from the OpenGL empty pixels and it combines it together. So what I get is, as a rendered frame, I get an edge, a black edge around my effect because it's like it's exporting, it's applying the effect into the black alpha from the OpenGL. You know what I mean?
I kind of know what you mean. I would
Yeah.
need to see. Mark's probably going to be a better person to
Yeah,
answer that question. He'll
for sure.
probably know what you're talking about faster than I do.
No worries.
Yeah. So 2 minutes up. That's a micro break. I needed it.
Was it 2 minutes up?
Just about, yeah. It's quick.
Cool.
It's good.
We good to keep going?
Yeah, we did have a question.
Sure.
Just while we're waiting for everybody to come back. Matt, you want to say that again?
Yeah. So for Mark, I have a situation where I have a scene that's fully composited. There's a like a light coming through in the scene, and there's some blending and whatever compositing that happens. But overall, the light in the scene is half transparent, right?
Okay.
I'm exporting the scene and without the background. So in Harmony, you have the black void, OpenGL void, without like fully alpha. When I render it out, the effect, instead of just being like the nice glow that I have just faded to transparency, it fades to black because I think it's the black from the OpenGL that it fuses with, and I'm trying to avoid that. Do you know what I mean? Or
Yep.
Yeah.
So basically, if you're compositing in one software and bringing it into another one, for example,
Yeah.
You can't export blend modes. You can't export glows. You can only export pixels and then reblend them in the next scene. But like, if I have a glow and I'm bringing it to After Effects, that's not going to work. I have to render I have a few tricks, obviously, but I have to render the layer and then reblend it, add a new glow in After Effects. If you have, for instance, a sequence that has a black edge, what you need to do then is pre-multiply it. Get a drawing here. In your drawing settings, when you import stuff, under drawing here, you'll see transparency type, pre-multiply with black, and that should do the math operation to know, hey, I made this thing over a black background, a transparent black background. This will then do the math to pre-multiply with black so that it knows how to properly blend it. But yeah, if you had a glow on the other software, it won't translate properly. I would render it
Right.
over transparency, bring that in, make sure it's pre-multiplied with black, and if that doesn't look good, make sure it's set to straight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then reapply a glow in here, or just say it used to be multiplied here. I'll render it as normal. In here, I'll reapply and multiply because that's how it's going to blend properly.
Right. So if I understand correctly, there's just no way to actually export from Harmony with the effect applied. In that case, I do have to go in that third-party software, reapply it there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you using After Effects or a different
Yes.
software?
Yeah.
So,
It's after.
So if you had, let's see here, suppose you have something like this, and that has a blur, and let's do something like that. It has a blur, and you're trying to export it. It's not going to remember that it's multiplied. So what I would do is disable that, and then you throw your right node here.
Right. Yeah.
Render
Sounds
that
good.
out, and then in After Effects, just reapply the blend mode. If you're using a glow,
Yeah.
instead, that can't translate out at all.
At all. Okay.
So that's where I go. There's techniques. There's techniques to get it to work right, and that technique would be, I'm probably gonna lose everybody if I try to explain it. Basically, you would you would render this glow over a black color card.
Okay.
Here.
Mhm.
So this would be
Yeah.
your how the glow is supposed to blend in on top of the color card.
Yeah.
And then you would render this matte blur of the
Mhm.
exact same settings. So suppose your intensity was 0.3 and that was a 3.
Yeah.
Then you would match your matte blur to have a 3 and a 0.3 intensity, but you would make that black as well.
Okay. Oh, so
And
it's
the
black on black, basically.
Yeah, except that
Okay.
this would render out with alpha. It would have a hole around it. The other one would be the glow with the black around it. And so in your After Effects, you would put your black shape, which would cut a hole. And then
Yeah.
you would put your black with white shape and you set that to add mode, which means that wherever is black is going to add whatever other pixels are. Wherever that
Right.
hole is will create a hole that you can just add the glow back on top.
Right.
It's a trial and error technique that is hard to explain with this specific example because it's
Uh-huh.
not what you've got. But there are multiple ways to try and get that result done. The best way is honestly to just turn off blend modes, recreate the blend modes in the other software. If you're using a glow, you got to do some trial and error, and basically in After Effects, rebuild that with a color that goes to screen, overlay, different transparency, make it look as good as you can.
Yeah, it's kind of annoying. I was hoping to not have to rebuild it in the third-party software, to be honest. So,
But that's not a limitation of Harmony or After Effects or Nuke. That's just how any software works. You can't export blending properties out of software.
Right. Yeah, it has to be baked in. The image has to be like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you so much for that.
No worries. We get to keep going?
Yeah, if you could go over, just make sure you have enough time to go through the items that have been uploaded in the Discord.
Yeah, I'll make sure for sure. We're already down to 45 minutes. I definitely want to just show a bit of lighting because that's just the sweet spot. Let's just remove that stuff here. So here's our original color. We've pulled out the eyes. Great. Now we want to create a rim light that the candle flame is casting light onto the character. So you're going to want to highlight, and if you go in your combine, or you could just type it in here, or you could just hit enter in Harmony 2122 now. So we've got a highlight, and we want to highlight this character. I'm just going to move that down. And we're going to want to tell it what it is. So first I have to create an offset. So we're going to use this apply peg transformation, and you can find it in your move. It's the second one. I really discourage using apply image transformation. That's a bigger lesson, but basically if things are on the edge of your screen, you'll get clipping. So keep using the peg one. And so if I wire this here, I can say add a peg to the transformation port of it, and then I can offset the character. So if I just put it on top, you'll see that if I move the character, I now have two characters, and I just basically shifted them over. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, you've got two characters, one on top of the other. Shift one over slightly and give me the resulting edge of if one is cutting the other. So if I go and add a cutter, that's to cut away mats. And I say, okay, this offset character is going to cut my original character. So that's the original character being cut by the offset. We're going to see this result. Now I'm stacking the character on top. So that's why you've got a bright character stacked on top of the original. But what I want to do is use that as the matte for the highlight. And that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a little rim light. Now this looks okay, but there are definitely things you can do to improve the look of it. One of it is if you want a hard lighting, you make the radius, the blur of your highlights 0, and that just makes it a hard edge. If you want a bit of blur, you can definitely up that blur to a 1 or a 2. The other thing we can do is give it a color. So right now it's just a brightening of the character, but we want it to be, the oranges of the color. So if I pick the color here, I just click in this area, I can choose an orangey color and go here, pick an orangey color, and that already starts to look a little better. But there's one more way to do it that looks even better, in my opinion, is to make the highlight multiplicative. What that does, and the best way that I can describe it is if you have a regular highlight, it's color on top. And if you have a multiplicative highlight, it's light hitting the character, which I feel more comfortable with. So if I click multiplicative in the highlight properties, you'll see that it goes to blue. Now, why is that the case? If I turn my color scale back, or color wheel back on, let's turn this guy off. Multiplicative is literally going to the other end of your color spectrum. So I wanted an orange color and it gave me the blue. So if I want to get that orange color in multiplicative mode, I got to go and pick a blue, which is the opposite end of the color spectrum. So turn that guy back on. We got multiplicative turned on. We're going to go and pick a blue, and that gives us a nice hot amount of light coming from that the flame. A little strong though, so you probably want to lower your alpha, your transparency there. So let's go 50 on that. So that's one thing we can do for a nice little highlight. What we might also want to do is limit it to where that flame is, because obviously, you know, we're getting light on the tip of the hair, on the back of the hand, and the light's probably not reaching that far. So we probably want to limit it to the area of the flame. So we can say, first of all, I want to explain why I'm doing it this way rather than doing it this way. You know, this will give you the same result, but now I've lost the control over limiting my shape because all of the information is in the highlight node. Me saying I'm going to cut it manually and then plug it in and reverse that cutter. Now I have the control. I'm telling it what the shape is before it goes into the highlight node, so I can control what I do with the shape. If the highlight node tells me what the shape is by inverting it, then I lose the control. And so that's why I always do everything outside. Same thing with that blur. I wouldn't put it in the highlight node. I would add a blur on the outside here. And now I have the control over that blur as well because it's not ingrained inside the highlight node. Now, cutting takes things away. Invert cutting limits it to it. So if I do an invert cutter, which is basically saying, I want to see that highlight only where I plug a shape. I'm going to create a zone. We're just going to create a drawing here. And if you had that, that flame, I believe is in here, if it had a peg, you would want to peg to it because you want it to follow the flame. I'm just going to peg it to the master peg in this case. But we're going to say, I want to see this highlight only where this shape is. And right now I've got no shape, so it goes away. But if I draw a circle, I'm just going to make a big circle. Now you can see that wherever that circle is going to reveal that shape, but not anywhere else. And obviously it's going to give me some weird results. So I want to blend that. And how do we blend that? We add a blur to our matte shape. We'll make that, I don't know, a 10. So now you have a flame that gets the highlight in the area where you want it and is blending down. We could do one more. We could duplicate that, do the same thing, wire that character, wire that cutter, and we're going to create a composite to combine both those sources. So now I've got the exact same thing. What I want to do is create a way bigger offset and a bigger blur, and we'll use that as bounce light. I'm going to offset that all the way over here. I'm going to make that 20. And then I'm going to add a transparency to that. 50% is the default. So now what you've got is you've got your rim light that's bright and hard edge. You've got a bounce light that rounds out your character even more with 50% more blur and more offset. And that just took a couple of obviously nodes, which looks a little complicated if you're not used to it. But the process is basically the same thing you would do if you wanted to do volumetric lighting, where you create lighting on each individual parts of that character. And that's limited currently to that drawing that we said that would just limit it to the flame. If we disable that, you can see it affects the whole character, but if we limit it, it makes the zone there. One thing you could do is darken that left side of the character. But again, just create a shape with a blur. Whoop. And a blur, we'll copy the blur here. Do I ever use volumetric lighting for harmony? Constantly. But I've developed a technique that I don't have to build it manually every time I'm in a scene. So we have a highlight, and now we'll use a tone instead. Highlight brightens, tones darkens. And we're going to wire that shape in, and I got to draw that shape. So let's zoom out a bit, and I'll just kind of create a bit of a darkness here. And then we'll zero out this here, and we'll control the blur, make that 50. And now you've got a little darkness on your character. Little tips to just kind of stitch your character in. So if we were to disable what we've done so far and see what we've come from and what we've done, you can see the original character, and we darkened it, and we created some lighting that's centralized to the flame, and then we created some darkness on the outside, which already starts to kind of create your scene with more depth. And I don't want to, I mean, there's so much more I want to do, but I know that I have to cover other stuff. Just going to give you a couple more tips of what you could do. You could create a peg and connect these two, and then just give it a little jitter back and forth, and that'll create that little jitter from the flame. You could also add a transparency here that pulses transparency, and that'll create a pulsing highlight from the flame as well. And this is just specific to the character on a simple offset. There's so much more you could do to the scene. Obviously, it's a storm outside. There could be lightning flashes. You can add stuff coupled with your effects department. I love playing around in these scenes. I always run out of time when I'm trying to explain them, but that's the gist of it. And that's just kind of like an overview of how you can sit your character in a scene and just kind of push the look of it. Obviously, if you're trying to get a series done with this, you better make sure you've got the time, the resources, the personnel, and that you're able to get this done. Otherwise, you really pull back. Any questions on the demo? Sorry, there was a question in here. Real nose volume objects and everything with a normal map. I'll be honest, Harmony's got some amazing tools. Volume objects and shading is not one of my favorites at all.
Yeah, me neither.
The reason for that is it's very limited, and you have to get very precise values for you to be accurate in establishing the look that you want. So yes, it's very good for a plug and play if you give the character some volume and then you move your light source around. It's very quick to light your character, but in order to get this specific look of a rounded offset with a hard edge lighting and everything like that, that requires more custom stuff like this, which I feel I can hit that look more accurately than using the volume shading. It has its uses, but I prefer to use different systems to get the looks I'm looking for. Cool. Shall we dive into some reviews?
Yes, please. I'm gonna answer a question that just came in too while you switch your scenes and I also want to mention that this scene was provided by students today. So Bass provided the animation and Andrea provided the background, and so they worked really well together. The background's actually animated, but we don't have time to go through. But I will use that to lead into the question. Maurice asked if when you're compositing an animated scene, is this done in every frame of animation? And so with Harmony, what's actually going to happen is you would set it up and then you would render it, and that would apply this effect to every frame. So you're not exactly, it's going to do it automatically, and you'll have to double check that every frame worked the way that you want it to. And I think Mark went over that really nicely when he showed the difference of the eyes. On how the first method of pulling the eye whites, if anything crossed over those eyes, the eyes were going to show through. So things to kind of keep an eye out, not intended, were there. But yeah, you always want to watch your renders and double check to see what you've done carries through. Sometimes Harmony can skip a frame too. So but yeah, if this scene was to get rendered, and maybe we can render the scene after the fact and upload it to the channel so you can kind of see the whole thing.
I mean, you can see as I click through it, the render evolves based on the settings that I've got in my nodes. There's one other little thing I wanted to do that I didn't get a chance to do real quick is you can do something even where the shadow gets darker under your light source by picking that skin shadow, which is this, and just making that value go down. And close that out. If you then stack your character, sorry, there's the original. If you stack this on top, and then you can use a cutter to limit to the shape again, to your flame shape, then wherever that flame shape is will darken the shadow of your character, which is also going to create more dynamic stuff. Anyway, I'm over time. Let's get let's check out some cool stuff. I think the first thing was, oh, here we go. Let's take a look at it together.
Jesus, man, I can't say that. I can't say that. I love that bit. You can't say that. I think it's how dare you judge him for marrying his 13-year-old. It was historically accepted at the time. I don't care. I judge thee. I can say that without condoning it. I judge.
That's awesome. Yeah, some of the lighting is really nice in here for sure. You know, I love the colors. I love I love high contrast. I love when you've got really bright areas and dark areas, and you've got that pump, and you know, you're leading your viewer's eye based on where the light direction is going. There's definitely some things I can suggest to help to assist. One of the things is when you're stacking light on top, this is sort of what I was talking in my demo, how you can affect the same string in Harmony, whereas you're just changing colors and changing stuff. But as long as you are continuing in the same line, then you're not changing the alpha or the edge of the character. When you stack things on top, you're stacking lighting, like the rim light on this right side character. Now you can see there's like a very, I'm not sure if you guys can see on your screen, but you've got a very thin little line where it's just a little dark line where it doesn't bleed the same amount. The best way to fix that in Harmony or in After Effects would be to make sure that that shape goes too far, basically beyond the character, and then clipping it back to your character, because that's going to use the original alpha of the character and clip it one time. So, you know, I put my character, I want to make a darkened shape on top, I want to make a highlight on top. I cut it one time instead of having all these cut versions of my character stacking, because every time you stack, that's where you're going to start to see an edge from the stacking. The alpha is doubling up, and that's what's creating that edge. If you put all your treatment once and you cut it one time at the bottom, then you're going to get a smooth edge and it'll look more natural. I think this is a puppet character as well, because I can see some line work here, and obviously you probably want to try to blend that tone in. What you could do, which actually you've done here, is you've got volumetric lighting, right? You've got rim light that's not just offset off the character, you've got it going from the ear and around the head and around this ear, which creates a lot more depth, which is fantastic. Depending on the style of your show, some people like hard edge lighting and some people like soft lighting. Soft lighting is really, you know, blurred and soft and rolls off the character. Hard lighting is less forgiving. So if I do an offset of a character that's hard lighting, I'll see all the defects, all of the offsets that are the very big tell, whereas soft lighting is more forgiving. You know, when I look at these fingers, I can't really tell what was offset, whereas if it was hard lighting, you'd see the individual fingers offsetting from that hand. But if you wanted to do hard lighting, there's definitely ways you can do it, and the more volumetric you are, the less offsetty it'll look, essentially. Obviously, when you're doing lighting a certain way, the blacks aren't accepting light, which is technically true. Black pixels wouldn't, would absorb light, wouldn't reflect it as much. But if you wanted to pick up on it, that's where you would have the difference between your highlight modes in Harmony, where you use multiplicative or not, Multiplicative will bring out the brights but not affect the blacks as much, whereas the normal highlight will wash out blacks. If you wanted to have it pick up, maybe use a combination of multiplicative to get that richness of the light, and then maybe a 10% normal highlight on top of that, just so you can pick it up on that black shirt if you wanted to have that volume. This is nice with the cast shadows. You also have to keep in mind where's that light source that's casting that shadow, right? If you want it to be precise. So if they have a porch light that's right at the top behind them, then this makes sense that the shadow would cast away from this character and away from that character. But technically, the shadow might come here if it was right behind them here. If it's really on this side, then I would expect this person's cast shadow to go forward to the left, since it's being pushed from that direction. Anyway, sticking on this one frame, but there's some nice stuff here. The style of this thing is probably more graphic than anything. If you wanted to plus it in a different way than just lighting, you could create depth of field, right? So you could basically have this part of the porch going into blur so that it pops the forward attention to the character here. There might be an issue here underneath the nose, which looks like maybe there's a seam in the rig. And this is the kind of stuff that I was talking about that compositing will find out when it hits production, that maybe we need to fix the way that it's rigged because this situation wasn't expected. Or perhaps it's the fact that the character has not been flattened, and when you apply lighting to a pass-through character, it can create seams where each piece is getting that lighting, creating an edge on that alpha channel. So that's possibly what's going on here, although I feel like that's probably just a rig stacking there. Let's see what else we got here.
I have a quick question. Could you pull, because I know show styles are always really different. Sometimes the lighting they want on top of the lines, not on top of the lines. But could you pull the black outline from this character the same way that you pulled the eye whites?
Yep, absolutely. You basically use a color override on the whole character, paint the entire character black, paint the line white, use that grayscale, and now you're going to have the result of the line alone. If you just throw a color override and say, hey, I only want to extract that color, it shows you every outline of every piece inside your character, which is why it's never been an option to just say color override, give me one color. But if you give it a black and white representation, and then you say, I only want what the white color is showing, and so you've got just the line work painted white, now you've got that as an alpha channel you can use to cut out of any lighting or add to any lighting if you wanted to make, say, the outline bright or dark. So yeah, that's definitely a way you could do that. I feel like perhaps, and this is, visually trying to interpret as best as I can how this came about. If this was done in Harmony, I would anticipate that the leg at the bottom is popping because the build wasn't flattened before I applied my lighting. And so that's exactly what's happening, is each piece is getting lit and not flattened. It's not applying it globally, it's applying it individually. And that's where you're going to get some of these issues happening where it's supposed to blend normally, but it's not. Or if this was done in After Effects, then I'd have to go into the After Effects project and see what happened there. But otherwise, the lighting holds up nice. It's nice and bright from the light source, which seems to be porch light. And again, this is where you want to have your cast shadows, right? You've got one person going here and this one going down. For this lighting to make sense, then the light would have to be to the right of the door. If it's right in the middle, then I would expect the right character's cast shadow to go to the right a little bit, because that's how it's casting. The other thing that's kind of cool is you've got some light going down, a little puddle shadow, and it's dropping, and it's kind of following the geometry of the steps. I think that's really nice. That's definitely the way you want to do it. You probably, if you're just trying to cast shadow and it's not working, there's no shame in adding a shape to just fill that out. So if you were using the character as a matte to create a black shadow, you could just draw an extra piece to that to fill where that shoe is hitting, so it doesn't have, it has a shadow underneath, and then just kind of animate to fix that issue that you have with the foot maybe. One thing that I would recommend is just to try to match your offsets. I'm noticing that in some scenes, the offset, if I go back to, say this scene here, the offset here is a certain amount off the ear. And if I go over here, it's doubled. And so this is where, if you don't have volumetric lighting like you did in the other scene, your offset's definitely going to show, right? You're gonna know it's a straight offset because that other ear is bleeding into the other one. How do you flatten a build? You add a bitmap composite at the bottom, or you change the bottom composite of the character to bitmap. One thing to remember though is if that goes back to animation, they're used to having everything pass through because they have to play with Z depth. So as soon as you flatten a character, you're breaking the ability for them to interact with Z depth since everything goes to a single depth. And there are definitely tricks to fix that, but just it's a good idea to have a network where you flatten the character on your side and you leave the original animation as a regular pass-through so they can rewire that normally and not have to deal with your network. And then when ready, you can plug it back in. That's one of the beauties of the Harmony is you're able to work on a separate network, and then animation can just plug their thing back in, work on it, and then all of the information still works with your network when it comes back to compositing. There's definitely some advantages to After Effects as well for that, but if everything's contained in Harmony. Yeah, for stuff like that, I would just probably create a little mat to cut away the highlights so it just starts at the edge. I generally start any rim light on line work so that it doesn't go into the abyss of nothing. Just scroll around this a bit more. I mean, I think this is hilarious anyway. The whole clip and the sound effects are great. When you run into problems like this, that might be stacked pieces together, creating that alpha edge doubling up. So you're getting a little, again, I can see it on my screen. I don't know how small it is on everyone else's screen, but there's a little rim edge here. And then if you're trying to combine lighting here in Harmony, if you apply the highlight to the same shape, if you combine all your highlights you're trying to do and throw the same highlight node in every piece, you should be able to avoid the stacking. If you're still getting that stacking, it might be because of that alpha edge that's doubling or tripling out. But yeah, for the most part, this is pretty interesting. There's your depth of field where you're really blurring your background so you've got focus on your character. And the closer your character is to your camera, the more you want to blur that background. If you're trying to make something look big, there's nothing that makes something look bigger than cutting depth of field. So if I wanted to make this guy look like a giant, if I make this background sharp, then all of a sudden it makes that character feel huge because I'm so close on him. But in order to focus on him, the camera's depth of field needs to be shallow. That's how big that character's going to be. If I want to make him, a focus, but not make him feel huge, then I blur the background. That's one of the tricks I've learned from one of my director of photography, was change the way that I comp, and hopefully that helps you. So if you've got an over-the-shoulder shot, suppose we were starting the frame right here, and you wanted this character to look big, you wouldn't blur them. But if you wanted to create just a normal sense, you'd blur them, and that would create a normal sense of they're the same scale. She's just closer to the camera.
I have a quick question, just based on what you just said. How would you go about studying comp and lighting? You said a director of photography, and I thought that was really interesting because then you're pulling in reference from movies and films, and I'm just wondering if you have any tips or resources that you can kind of like share.
I can honestly say that myself, I like to just do stuff and experiment and not get too bogged down by the technical stuff. But the more technical stuff you understand, the better of an artist you become. If you do want to study how to do even more in compositing, then you can definitely study photography principles, which will dictate, your cone of your angle in your camera, your depth, your field of view, as they call it, your focal points. That's the same. Everything that has to do with cameras is applicable to After Effects, to Harmony. That's, the bigger meat and potatoes if you want to get really deep into it. But if you just study the way things look, You don't necessarily have to understand every technical aspect. If you can visually replicate what you're trying to do, that's the main thing. I would say study cinematography. That's the positioning and composition of shots. And some of the best cinematography I've ever seen was Road to Perdition. I'm dating myself, but that was a fantastic movie back in, I want to say, the late 90s, if I'm not mistaken. That had fantastic cinematography and just kind of gets your eye developed for, hey, where is the viewer trying to look? If I'm trying to make the viewer look here, I'm blurring the foreground, I'm creating a vignette so that the viewer looks at the focal point I'm trying to get to. The director of photography I worked on was on a feature film. It just kind of gives you a different perspective, understanding what your craft is and why you do certain things, right? You might be blurring a background and not knowing how much to blur or why you're blurring it or where to blur it. If you understand how cameras work and how you want the viewer's eye to go, that's where you're going to start to develop those techniques of field of view, understanding the focal point you're trying to get and what direction in cinematography and direction of photography is going to help with that part of the craft. There's just so much to compositing that nobody knows. And I'm so glad to see so many people come out, because generally people don't know comp, so they don't come out to learn these things. But there's a lot of stuff you can do, not only for the compositing part, but to understand how to fix any other department's part. And that just kind of gets you involved a lot more in the entire production pipeline in animation.
It's a great entry level job too. Compositors are always kind of in need, whereas animators might be a little bit more competitive. There might be a lot more of a pool to pull from, but if you've got compositing under your belt, it's typically a bit of a more stable job. Maybe not amazing last year, but.
As a one last comment on this thing before we move on to the next one, I do want to say I really like this. We call this a crash blur. It's basically the camera zooming so fast that it streaks towards the character. And I think this is very successful. Obviously, you crash zoom and blur, and as you settle your camera, you reduce your zoom again. The only thing I would say that could potentially help this is multiplaning, right? So if your background is pushed back further and your camera is going towards that character, the background is going to move at a different speed than the character, and it'll create that extra depth in your crash blur. So if I'm, zooming in this way, the background wouldn't move towards the camera as much. If it's further back, the character would move faster, and that would create that extra separation, which would really help the shot look even better. This is great.
Okay, we got 15 more minutes.
Cool.
So
Let's look at the next one. Let's see here.
Oh, excellent. I think Piper is in our chat. Piper wants to talk. You can unmute yourself if this is your film. It's a cute little short. I like
That was really cute.
the traditional looking, everything's like wiggly jiggly on the face. It's
Yeah.
cool.
No, I love the style of this. And I think you commented in Discord about the textures. I think it's really.
I only said that because it's we do it the other way so often, and it's really a style preference. It's not right or wrong. So it's neat to see something where the characters, I always want to do the characters are just moving through the textures, and here I get to see it. So that's what caught my eye.
Yeah, and I think the textures are great. First of all, they're high resolution, which is really a good thing. Too often we see people throw textures into their characters, and they don't anticipate if the character's close to camera, does that texture hold up resolution, or is it going to start looking blocky and low resolution, right? But this looks really rich. Obviously, the fact that they're moving through the textures is a style. If you really wanted to, like Lindsay says, you can peg it to the geometry, shape it, and track with it. Textures is always really, I wouldn't say a nightmare for animation, but they don't love it because then they have a lot more to track than just their own art and their own motion. But yeah, you can definitely do stuff like this at the comp stage as well. I think this is really nice. There's if you had the opportunity to do volumetric lighting, this would plus it that much more, where you don't have to do every arm, every leg, every piece. But if say that extension of the far antenna on the red character was on its own behind it, then it wouldn't create this gap, and that would just make it a little bit more plus that way. But this looks, it's got a really nice style. I think when you got close-ups like this, you definitely would want to blur out your background. That will bring the focus to the main characters, and you'd want to blur out your character in the foreground as well. That forces the viewer to look specifically at the characters. If you wanted to shift the focus from the characters to the person in the foreground, then you would do what's called a rack focus, where you transition the midground characters to be blurred at the same time as you transition your foreground character to unblur. And you're just going to feel that camera pull the focus, and you do that to the background as well. So that's an option there. I like the against the light treatment, where you've got rim light around the characters and you've darkened the core. One of the things you could do there is pop the eye whites. Even 20% would just read the expression that much more when you're darkening a character that much. Let's see what else we got here. I like the style of the line work. It's got that nice little pencil texture, which I've noticed when it was used to run across the stage here, actually. So the shadows are picking up that same texture. If that's something desired, great. If it's something you didn't want, if you're doing it in Harmony, you can use something called the increase opacity node, and that basically will fill those little semi-transparent textured edges. If you were in After Effects, you could use a curve node set to alpha and just kind of crush the curve so that it doesn't have the same semi-transparencies. But if you like it that way, then great. One thing I'd say is if you have a shadow over here and the shadow is really soft on the ground, if you want the shadow to really flatten, what I've started doing a lot with my productions for several years is you blur it more horizontally than vertically, and that just kind of flattens the shadow more instead of just being a general blur. If you're in Harmony, you can use something called a box blur. Check on direction and blur more in width than length. And if you're in After Effects, I think they have a box blur, or you can just use directional blur one way and a regular blur, Gaussian blur vertically. But if you have that style, you probably want to keep the same style when they're running on stage here, so that they have a similar blur flattening them up, just to keep on target. I think if I wanted to focus on the character, actually if I wanted to focus on the crowd, just to change it up, I'd blur the background and I'd blur the foreground and the stage slightly so that we can see their reaction. If I want to focus on the character, then I'd blur the crowd a little bit more, and as we go further back, I'd blur a little bit more and more. But I think the lighting in this is really unique and nice. I like how the crowd characters just have to be purple because they're just background and they fit. That's especially nice, the very bright light that's casting upon them. I would probably just kind of recommend similar thing to what I said, is make sure your rim light offsets are similar. I guess unless you're trying to get the idea that the spotlight's focusing on the middle three and so the other two are getting less light. Otherwise, they all have a similar offset of light. But I love the bounce light happening. And technically this offset's casting shadow. I would just try to, especially when you got little lines like that, it's nice to put those behind the character, give them their own treatment so that you have a nice silhouette of that head without interfering with the rim light there.
And Mickey says that they love this, that love the style. That went to the
Yeah,
organizer. I figured
it's super unique. This one scene is one of the ones that stuck out, that if I were to do anything else, I would blur the background. Then you've got your characters really popping, but that foreground light is really nice. The the unity in them and the texture work is really cool. Oh, this one might need a bit of an up-res, but you know, now I'm just being picky. It's just really cool to have these textures. I especially love this green, like crystal looking texture there. Oh, there's little particles. I didn't even notice the little particles there in the light. That's cool. The closer you are, the bigger they would get. And what you could do is also create that turbulence noise effect, which is a black and white noise. Use it as a matte. So again, the black goes transparent, the white stays, and then you make the white affect them so that they look like they're twinkling a little bit. Every time the white catches it, it would just glow them brighter. Cool. Any other questions or comment on this one?
Nice job. That's a
Great
C.
job.
Thank you. I really appreciate all your feedback. This was the third act of my senior film that I worked on with over 10 other people, and huge props goes to the director Jessica Lee, who came up with doing the shadow effect and worked hard to make sure that all the textures were high res.
Yeah, it looks fantastic. It's really cute. I love it. I know this wasn't posted in the comment. I just wanted to bring it up to talk about how I love this dapple effect. Dapple effect is like when you have shadow cast from treetops. It just kind of creates this little texture on a character when they walk underneath. These little accents that you can do in your comp is what's going to make things stick out even more if you just kind of have these little touches. So you got rim light, but you can also have the absence of light because of it, and I just think that looks really cool. Okay, and we had one reel. Let's look at that. I don't know if I mute myself if you hear the volume. I'll try that because I don't want to get double audio. Let me know if you can't hear this.
Can't hear it.
All right, I'll leave it on then. And I know this one has multiple scenes, so I might just kind of break it down and just talk about each scene briefly, so we get to check all of them. So there's a lot of nice work in After Effects here. I love the eases. Particle effects are really cool. One thing I would mention about the particles is if you could, here, let's go back. If you could limit them from not showing here and just kind of have even just a gradient mask to reveal them only when they are from the fire and up, that would definitely be best, since the particles shouldn't necessarily show behind the chair since they're emitting from the fire. But I love that you're tracking the camera with it really nicely. I do want to move on to the next one because there's some nice stuff in here.
Bass, if you have any questions and you want to ask specifically, feel free to unmute yourself. Go
I
straight
will,
to the
thank
story.
you.
Yeah.
Since you're here, the tracking in After Effects, was that hand tracked or tracking a piece?
Yeah, that was so I originally colored the line art with a really bright value so that the difference, like the motion tracker could, like that's why the pieces of the nose and the forehead are that color,
Yeah.
so that like could detect the difference. But then I actually found that just creating a null object and going frame by frame and just like manually moving the position on like say the tip of the nose actually went super quick once I had the keyboard shortcut set up, and it gave me more control rather than just like expecting, because After Effects would track the dots, the colored dots sometimes, but then it really lost track of them other times, so I spent almost more time fixing it than I would have just doing it by hand, going frame by frame.
Yeah, sometimes, first of all, the After Effects tracker is not the greatest. In After Effects, you do have access to Mocha, which is a much better tracker, but you need to just kind of have a learning curve how that works. I will say when I'm trying to track things that I bring into After Effects, especially if it's coming from, say, Harmony going into After Effects from Puppet animation, I'll create these crosshair drawings, just bright red crosshairs, and render those out. And After Effects has a really good way to track crosshairs because it can see the contrast between corners, and so it won't be slipping on art. Same thing with, your drawing, you've got orange and you've got yellow. If there wasn't a physical like angle, then After Effects would slip less tracking those. But the null object is a good way to go about it. I like this camera shake when he roars, and if you want to use blurs to accentuate it, one thing I like to do when I have a big beast that roars, I have, specifically in After Effects, you would use CC radial blur, which is a blurring node that you can use to spin around or you can blast from. And so if you put the pivot point in the throat and you just kind of blast values of the CC radial blur, go between 0 and 3, and you just kind of toggle 0 and 3, it'll create this kind of shaking, blurring at the same time, which will just create this very powerful roar. That's something that could definitely push that asset for sure. It's way easier in After Effects to create shapes to track because you can animate masks, and I think right over here, this is what you've done. Whereas in Harmony, you would have to draw it frame by frame, or you would have to draw a shape and then create a deformer and animate that deformer. So it's a little less intuitive in Harmony, but in here I see that you've created multiple masks, and since things are moving, that makes a lot of sense. The only thing I would suggest here, and you see it more when this hand comes up, is at the bottom of the screen. I don't know if I can, there you go. If you can add, cutting away right at the edges here. Oh, man, my mouse is not showing, but right where the edge of the cliff is, because that would be behind the cliff edge, right? Otherwise, this works really nicely, and I love the traditional style of it too. And the fact that you added this gradient is really neat. If you're trying to, because you only have, a ramp in the background, if you can create a variable blur, in Harmony, it's really easy. We have a value for that. In After Effects, you would probably create an adjustment layer with your blurred mask, and anything going into that adjustment layer would blur out just to create some depth. If you're trying to get zero blur, then forget what I said. What you can do to create more texture is a turbulence noise, soft, subtle, so that it creates more texture if you really wanted to. But yeah, do we have time to watch one last little section, Lindsay?
I mean, take it.
Oh, I just want to look at this last little section.
You are absolutely, like, we're not holding you hostage. You can drop
Okay.
out, it's fine. But if you've got the time, it's
yeah.
I want to know.
Let's look at the rest of this. First of all, I love the breakdowns. That's super awesome when you're looking at something, you want to see how everything was built or what the person did, and showing in segments. That's really cool.
That's good to know. I think I struggle with showing the process and like what's appropriate to show. So I really appreciate the feedback.
You're definitely showing more than most would, because you're showing the innards of the software. What people would usually do is they'll show the full scene, and then they'll do a wipe, and they'll show one pass and one pass and one pass. This is just very interesting. Right. Shows the person your thought process as well.
Right.
So because you're using a texture in Maya and you're laying it down either in Maya or After Effects, it's obviously stretching that texture quite a bit. What I would suggest to help with that is, obviously, if you can't get a bigger texture, you could create some noise to just kind of break up the texture, either using the noise node or turbulence noise, and try to find You know, fractional Brownian is the standard, but just kind of creating extra little texture here and there.
Mhm.
And you can stack them so that it creates this weird pattern that nobody can really tell what it is. Or you keep this, but you start to blur it in motion, right? So
Oh,
that's
that would have
not,
been smart.
but if you're blurring it in motion and you've got these cracks, you'll also have to blur the cracks because they're part of the ground. And if you
Mhm.
don't blur the cracks, then they're going to look pasted on top. But if you blur them with it,
Mhm.
it'll look like it's part of it. I love the glows coming from the cracks. That's really cool.
This
Every
was
time, yeah.
oh, so sorry.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say this was one of my fourth year films I did with one of my classmates, and we were definitely really feeling the time crunch. And so I really appreciate like the attention to detail, and I know there's definitely some things I could have done to make this more successful, and I really appreciate the perspective.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally get being stuck on a time crunch. That you only have so much time. You got to do what you can out of it. Um, and this is just advice if you want it, and if you had the extra time, then you could throw these in. Such as like every time he takes a step, you've got a little camera shake. That's cool. If you add a little directional blur, one thing you can do in After Effects is an expression called jitter. You can put in a blur an expression that says jitter every frame. You know, add blur of 2 to 0, and it'll just create this random little blur moment when he steps on, and that will just create a little bit more dynamic
Mhm.
oomph to the picture, shall we say. But I love the chase. I think that's really cool, the angle that you keep following. And I know how, you know, it's tricky. You got to figure out how to get the final picture to look like what you want using the different softwares you've got. That's why
Mhm.
I think this is great because you're not sticking just to Harmony. You're not sticking just to After Effects. You did what you needed to do to get the final picture, and you popped the eye whites, which
Mhm.
chef's kiss, right? Yeah, really nice work. Obviously, the only other thing is if you could get this background to just slowly drift with everything. I'm not sure if we got that going.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good idea. No, you're totally right. Oh, you know what? It's so funny. I remember when I was working on the shot, I was like, I've got the parallax, I've got the shake, I've got like, there's something missing here that's like not adding to the feeling of depth and like distance traveled. And you know what? I think that's it.
Yeah, but I think, you know, put all those elements together and you've got an even better product. You've got a really good product regardless, but adding that slow drift with everything as we're panning with the camera would really would push it that extra edge. Very cool. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Do we have any additional questions? I mean, I got more questions than I expected to ever get because people just don't know what to ask for comp since it's such an obscure subject. But I appreciate everybody showing up today. Hopefully you enjoyed it and you learned some stuff and you saw some cool stuff you might want to continue on. That's kind of all I got.